today I'm here to talk to you about why effective storytelling matters. And before I get started, just in case you're wondering who the hell is this guy, so let me give a bit of background about myself. So my name is Olugbeminiyi Idowu, aka Mr. Bemi, as most people call me. Many people, not most people. I run a company called Talking Drum Communications, and at Talking Drum we work with companies innovating on the continent, helping them get more effective publicity for the work they're doing. Over the course of my career, I've had the good fortune of working with some of these brands that you may have heard of. Those that you haven't heard of, I hope you get to hear about them very soon. And so basically the work we've done for these guys is, like I said, just helping them curate their stories and helping them get more effective publicity for the work they're doing. Before we get too far in, I thought it would be useful to give you a bit of context and backstory on myself, which may give you a better understanding of why I'm standing here and why I do what I do. So I was born and raised in Nigeria. I lived there for most of my formative years until I moved to the UK in 2002. And at the time I moved to the UK, it was pre this Afrobeat wave. Nollywood wasn't popping like that. There was no tech ecosystem. So when you opened your mouth and you said, I'm from Nigeria, the only conversation people wanted to have with you was about how much lack, poverty, and deprivation there was on the continent. And at that time, that whole situation didn't sit very well with me, but life had to go on, right? Like, I'm not gonna stop my life because someone really doesn't understand where I'm coming from. But at that time, I felt like there's certainly more to us as Africans. There was more to me as a Nigerian than all these stories that people were trying, all these conversations that people were trying to have with me. But again, like I said, life had to go on. And then fast forward a few years, I found myself working on the PR team of some of the companies that I mentioned earlier. And it was in working with these companies that I was exposed to how they intentionally shaped the perception people had of them. So for them, it wasn't just about something happened, we have to go and talk about it. They'd already decided the perception they wanted people to have of them, and everything then fed into that perception. And that understanding and that sort of awareness was a game changer for my sort of approach to storytelling. Because sometimes people think about storytelling as something happened, let's go and talk about it. But quite often it's like, no, before that thing happened, you need to figure out what story you're trying to tell so that when things are happening, you can piece it together and you can use those happenings to support what you want to achieve as a company. And I'm coming at storytelling from a PR person's perspective, and I know there's a lot of questions about what exactly is public relations. And simply put, it's this: it's sharing and managing information to influence the perception of an entity. And that entity can be a person, it can be a product, it can be a company, it can be also different things. But what you really do and what we do as PR professionals, and as any PR professional will tell you, we share and we help people manage information to influence how people perceive and how people understand what that entity stands for. And from my experience, what I've seen to be the case in terms of how large companies, and let's just call them successful companies, how they leverage storytelling, when you look at it from the PR perspective, is for most of them, they use it as something called a North Star. So for those who are not familiar with the concept of a North Star, the North Star is said to be the brightest star in the sky, and it's also believed to be very static. So before the days of maps and all these devices we have that give us direction, you'll be told to look for the North Star, and in looking at the North Star, you can then navigate your way through whatever situation you're working through. And for many companies I've worked for, and a lot of the work we do today at Talking Drum, the stories that we want to tell, like I mentioned before, act as that North Star, right? They act as that North Star that kind of orients what we're trying to do, right? The other thing is about communicating their purposes and communicating their values and their beliefs. So like I said before, when it comes to storytelling, too often I find that people look at storytelling as, oh, this happened, let's talk about it, and there's so many missed opportunities. And also there's this conversation about, does storytelling actually work? Like, what's the real value of storytelling? If I look at it from our perspective, in terms of the work we do at Talking Drum, we work in innovation and technology space. And one of the things that's happened consistently over the last few years is, as more stories of success have been told about what's going on in innovation and tech in Africa, we've seen an increase in venture capital funding. Even this year, that's going to be a down year in terms of the amount of money that's been raised. I was on a seminar the other day, And they're talking about how we've already crossed the $3 billion mark in a bad year. And a lot of that is down to the fact that people know that there's success stories on the continent and people are more willing and ready to invest in those opportunities. But there's another side to that success, or in terms of how storytelling works, and that's in terms of the perception of the people who those stories have been told about. So around this time last year at Token Drum, we launched a report called the Africa Innovation Impact Report, and for that report, we spoke to 4,500 people from Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya to kind of understand their we asked them a few questions about the impact of the recent innovation stories that have come out of the continent. And one of the questions we asked them is the one on the screen, is that how have the recent developments impacted your perception of the continent? As you can see on the graph, like the vast majority of people said yes. But that's not all of it. The other side of this is we then went on to ask them how likely are they to describe Africans as innovative and entrepreneurial. You can also see that in the first two columns, very likely and somewhat likely, the vast majority of people are now likely to describe themselves as innovative and entrepreneurial. Now, you can ask the question of whether that would have been the case before, whether that's always been the case. But I like to think when I spoke to people before, like in the early days, like again, when you look back to those days when I first moved to this country, when people spoke about Africans were not described as innovative and entrepreneurial at that time. So if we look at it in that context, a good way to measure it is these innovations are not just bringing money into the continent, they're shaping perceptions, they're shaping how we view ourselves. It's not about shaping how people view us. These innovations and these stories that we're telling, they're shaping how we view ourselves. So I guess the question is then, how do you tell effective stories? Big shout out to Tales by Moonlight. Anyone that is a certain vintage in Nigeria will know Tales by Moonlight. So I'll just put, there are many different tips you can put forward, but again, because we only have a short period of time, I'm only going to run through 5 tips that I've learned in my career and 5 tips that we live by at Talking Drum to help us tell effective stories for our clients and the work they're doing. And the first one is clarity. It sounds very obvious, but quite often after we hear people tell their story, in many cases, you're like, okay, it's a good story, but what exactly were you hoping to achieve by telling that long story? And by telling that long story, how did you expect your story to impact the outcome you're actually after? Again, it sounds very obvious, but sometimes the valuable things are very obvious. So the first question we like to ask is, before you say anything, ask yourself what you are hoping to achieve and how saying that will help you achieve what you want to achieve. And also to bear in mind that clarity doesn't just happen. You have to be intentional about it. You have to actually sit down, have the right heads in the room, have the right minds, devote the right resources to making sure that you review the situation, you sit down, you pick through the weeds, you unpick it, you spend time, you build the right story that you know is going to work, you road test it, like all the product people in the room will know. If you're building a product, you don't just build it and put it out there. You test it, you refine it, and then you put it out there knowing that it works. The next thing is that what you are saying is more important than how you sound. That's another thing that people typically come to us with, and they say, oh, I want to sound like this people, I want to sound like that person. And it's like, okay, that's all well and good, but what exactly do you want to say when you're sounding like this person or that person? I think that, again, that sounds like a very obvious thing, but it's a recurring theme that we see in the work that we do, trying to almost like weed people back and say, hey, at the end of everything you're saying, there's another human being at the end of whatever you're communicating. So bearing in mind that whether you're a large organization or whether you're a company that's just starting, that human-to-human element, the decision maker in the process is still another human being. And you have to make sure that you understand that person's needs, and when you're communicating with them, the way your story lands on the other end to them is in a way that they can communicate, they can connect with effectively. And then consistency. I think Yele mentioned consistency as well. I think I echo on that. I think consistency beats intensity. There's an old saying about slow and steady wins the race. Like there's an old marketing principle about the law of 7, which is basically the idea that for you to convert a potential buyer into an actual buyer, they need to be exposed to your brand and to your messaging at least 7 times, or an average of 7 times, I think. And when you think about it in that context, if you're consistent, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If you're inconsistent and you're doing many different ways, you do one today, you do another one somewhere else, you do another one somewhere else, what you're inadvertently doing is you're just prolonging your conversion cycle because you're not consistently pursuing the same goal. So it's about being consistent and just sticking to whatever it is that you want to achieve and just going on by it. And another thing is about playing to your strengths. For me, this is very important because there are many companies out there doing great things, they're doing wonderful things, they're not where they want to be, and they're like, oh, just because I'm not where I want to be, I can't tell my story yet, or let me tell the story about this other part that I want to do. And it's like, no, play to your strengths. Use what you have to get what you want. And that applies to your storytelling as well. Like it says on the screen, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And then you take it from there, you keep refining the thing. And then the final thing I want to sort of mention in terms of tips is focus on the opportunity. I feel very strongly that there are more than enough stories about Africa's problems out there in the world. So I don't think we need to populate that narrative about Africa's problems. And I think that narrative is sufficiently populated, right? The other thing that I feel has not been communicated enough, the other story that hasn't been told enough, is the story about Africa's opportunities. Africa is overflowing. I know we have problems. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend like we don't have problems. Yes, we have many, many problems. But Africa is overflowing with opportunities. And I feel like sometimes we are like this guy. Let's focus on opportunities. Opportunities are also more attractive than challenges. Let's just bear that in mind. Like if you meet someone and the first thing you offload on them is your million problems, they're going to run away. So from a storytelling perspective, when you tell stories about ourselves, let's focus on the opportunity, especially in an African context. I think something that I find to work very well, is very useful, very, very beneficial. And then again, just to round up, I think the final thing is, we said, we talk about why effective storytelling matters. And I believe very strongly, I wish this quote was original to myself, it's not. But great stories happen to people that can tell them. Great stories happen to people that can tell them. So it's important that we cultivate habits of telling good stories about ourselves, telling effective stories about ourselves, stories that help us to achieve what we want to achieve. And in doing that, I believe we can support all the other things we're doing to achieve success and access all the things that we want. Thank you very much.